We have to start right now with the structural panel. I'm stopping sharing to share my presentation right now. I'm also the moderator of this first panel. So I'm going to introduce the first speaker, who is Julia Kowitz. Julia is currently an undergraduate student of modern languages and its literatures at Complutense University of Madrid. She was my student. I love you. She participates as a content writer in social media team of the journal Literary Theory and Comparative Literature a la Este at Complutense University of Madrid. A music passionate from birth, she also released an EP for Free Music Archive in high school in 2015. In that same year, she won 2 nominations, the Fest Teen Festival at the Cultural Center Matadero de Madrid, and a conference as part of a TED Talk in Madrid cycle. Previously, she studied common physics subjects in the bachelor degrees in electronic communication engineering at the Complutense University of Madrid. And she will be in charge of the presentation Beyond the Wertherian Motif of Suicide, the unity of the self in Karoline von Günderrode's death. Please, Julia, the floor is yours. So, whenever you want. Please switch your microphone on.
Is it
okay?
Right now? Yes.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for such a beautiful introduction. Today, thank you all of you for being here. I'm Julia. I will be sharing a summary of my upcoming research. I hope you enjoy listening. I am open to questions when I finish sharing. So, yes, I will share it with you now. Yes, share here a PowerPoint here so that you can see it together with me. Great. Yes?
Yes.
Great.
Here it is. Thank you.
Can you see it now? Yes. Great. Oh, thank you. Great. Great. So, yeah, in order to understand the motives and inner forces that drove the German Romantic poet Karoline von Günderrode to voluntary death, I must first enumerate a series of historical, political, social, and cultural circumstances that shaped the particular worldview of the fragmented and dwindling Holy Roman Empire during its last years of existence. The first chapter of my research will therefore be based on this contextualization, while the second one exhaustively analyzes the indications and clues of her suicide present in her work and in her epistolary production, as well as the ideas that exerted a notable influence on her thought. This last part is of particular relevance. The thesis of the article, which consists in the idea of death as preservation of the unity of the individual and therefore of the earth, is drawn from a synthesis of prior academic investigations of Günderrode. On this basis, I add and qualify my own original point of view, which sees in Günderrode's suicide the symbol of 2 complementary forces, one of dissolution, the other of unification or agglutination. The first takes up the Günderrodian idea of death as dissolution, insofar as the individual is diluted in the totality of nature and with it. The second perfects the tendency to which the will of the earth is impaired, to evolve the own time that each individual harbors during his short existence, so that it follows a state ever closer to the absolute. The key to this new perspective on Günderrode's suicide lies in the coexistence of 2 poles or opposites, which united give shape to her philosophical system and consequently explain the undercurrent of a large number of poems, dramas, and plays about death. We will therefore have to, we will therefore have to distinguish two types of works. Those that directly explain her philosophical thought on the one hand, like for example An Eusebio or Geschichte eines Brahminen, and those that apply it creatively or are influenced by it on the other, such as Ariane of Naxos, Die Malabarischen Witwen, or Die Wande der Liebe. Towards the last 2 decades of the 18th century, the milestone of the French Revolution caused fervent enthusiasm among the educated strata of German society, Bildungsbürgertum in German, who saw in the event the realization of reason and the establishment of the rights of mankind. In the words of Friedrich von Gentz, the revolution is the first practical triumph of philosophy, the first example of a form of government based on principles and a coherent system. In fact, this basis of collective acceptance of the ideas of the revolution in Germany was greatly facilitated by an earlier reformist debate. The role assumed by the German intellectual majority was undoubtedly that of an enthusiastic spectator during the years leading up to the Jacobin terror. Instead of bloody revolutions, spectator Germany urged the princes to push for new reforms and to maintain those already begun. More and more reformers argued about the disastrous consequences of a hypothetical revolution, for which Germany, according to some intellectuals such as Franz Wilhelm Jung, was not prepared, given the almost feudal and medieval character of much of the Holy Roman Empire, which nevertheless received with increasing eagerness the compendium of new revolutionary ideas, and with it the colossal edifice of the new modern era. This being the case, the poet suffered, like Faust in Goethe's literary fiction, the collapse between tradition and modernity. In Biermann's words, it is an epoch whose thought and sensibility are modern, but whose social and material conditions are still medieval. Christa Wolf shares this view of Günderrode and some of her contemporaries around 1800 as she stresses the idea of a type of individual who, having been born at an early and incomplete stage in the development of the new bourgeois class, is relegated to oblivion due to his inability to adapt to traditions, beliefs, and institutions stuck in the past, of which they do not feel a part. That is why Wolf refers that society uses them as sketches or projects. Although the period between 1790 and 1815 in Germany was marked by an unprecedented rise in women's first-hand engagement with literature, they were scarcely integrated into mainstream male intellectual circles who saw the white woman as a real threat. In fact, with a few exceptions, such as the daughters of important scholars, women were totally excluded from university education in the territories of the Holy Roman Empire. During the second half of the 18th century, men referred to the need for an educated bourgeois woman, but always subordinated to the inferior status, which justified the fact that, for example, they had to be educated by means of a particular genre, which they agreed to classify under the label für Damen, for ladies, or für das Frauenzimmer, which is a derogative term in German. In fact, this being the general thinking of the time, it is not surprising that Karoline von Günderrode felt alienated from the behaviors of her sex, which she often referred to as an incomprehensible agent. In a letter to Gunda Brentano sent in August 1801, Karoline acknowledges her affinity towards the masculine. Many times I have experienced the unladylike desire to throw myself into a fierce battle, to die. Why wasn't I a man? I am not made for feminine virtues, for the anodyne happiness of women. I am attracted only to the wild, the great, the splendorous. In fact, not only does she dare to publish Gedichten und Fantasien under the male pseudonym Tian, but in her philosophical system, she establishes the origins and primordial forces in the mother's womb, based on the matriarchal models of Asia and the East, against the hegemonic and patriarchal conception of Greek mythology. It is a time when unclassifiable women are born within the specific constraints of their gender. Through the imaginary and infinite center of correspondence, these women begin an intense dialogue with themselves, setting themselves up at last as independent subjects who attempt to understand the self without any other intermediary. They are women who find the bourgeois order of Germany without revolutions unbearable because they simply do not fit into it. That is why many of them saw marriage as the only available path. Rachel van Hagen thus secured her position within society in such a way that once society had at least partially assimilated her, the writer continued her intellectual work without any outside disapproval. This was also the fate of other women, such as the sisters Marianne and Sara Meyer, Dorothea Schlegel, Henriette Gietz, and Rebecca Friedlander. Karoline, however, never married and never sought anything other than the truths of the spirit of the earth, love, truth, and the absolute. Günderrode was determined to carve her own path, and, like her friend Lisette, was not lacking in sharp criticisms of the society of her time. Let's move on to the next. We now enter the second chapter, which analyzes the indications and clues of the author's suicide present in her literary work and epistolary exchange. For this, however, a previous synthesis of her thought is essential. Although it remained strongly linked to the philosophy of her time, from the beginning the poet modeled her own path, groundbreaking and very courageous for the social context of her time. Take first of all the evolution of Günderrode's thought as an imaginary organism in constant change, whose main characteristic always consisted in the permanent search for the absolute. The poet devoted her entire existence to this idea, which she used as a reference system on which she gradually and partially added the thought of great intellectual contemporaries such as Novalis, Schelling, Fichte or Hölderlin. The particular influence of each of them on Günderrode's work is of a complexity and extent that goes beyond the scope of this research, which aims rather to clarify the motivations underlying the author's voluntary death through her work and production. Karoline found the permanent search for the absolute, like many of her contemporaries, in a primitive state and prior to consciousness. She considers this absolute organism as eternal, so that she identifies it with the old time, Altzeit in German, and with nature's own will. Günderrode states that the immortality of life rises and falls in its members, the elements, and whatever has returned to the same through dissolution, which we sometimes call death, which mingles with them according to laws of relation, etc., etc., etc. Especially noteworthy is her particular interpretation of death as dissolution, Auflösung in German, whose components, the spiritual and the natural, depend on it to mutually come into contact with each other. Indeed, Günderrode considers that the earthly is a manifestation of the spiritual that enables us to realize moral ideas. In this way, death serves as an agent of contact between two seemingly irreconcilable elements, which are, however, part of the same will, the earthly and the spiritual, the body or the fragile vessel, and the person of all time, Allzeit. Günderrode sets out the basis of this thought in An Eusebio. Thus, every time a person returns to the earth a higher and more developed elementary life, and the organism, by taking into itself more and more developed elements, must thus become more and more perfect and general. The will of the earth, therefore, is expressed through each individual, which evolves the old time, Altzeit, to the extent that it harbors it and fulfills its function as a fragile vessel, the culmination of which is realized through death. Death constitutes for Günderrode a dispersion of its own elements in nature, not the end of everything. It allows the spirit of all time to develop, more and more evolved on each individual. This conception is based, and so it is explicitly stated in the work, on the Indian idea of the transmigration of souls. The influence of Fichte is also clear. However, while the latter considers that the mechanism of will is exclusive to human beings, whose acts obey a free will and not a mechanism of nature, Günderrode holds that nature as a whole expresses a will, or in other words, that all natural beings are self-directed in some way. In fact, all of Karoline's intellectual efforts are devoted to the knowledge of this mysterious invisible, which in Das Reich der Töne she describes as a mysterious life that dwells in all matter but is imprisoned in it. She wants to find any way to approach this living spirit that hovered over matter when all things were still mixed into gross masses. The infallible and preferred method will be death, suicide, although she has previously tried poetry. The poet sees in death the determination of man, the way to preserve his unity, which precisely is reaffirmed by denying one's own individuality. To shed light on this idea, the content of her work Gesichter eines Brahminen is indispensable. In this particular dual monologue between a man and his apprentice, the first, Omo, tells the young apprentice about his experience and narrates how a new circumstance suddenly opened up the still unknown depths of his own mind. The moral world, hitherto invisible to him, was revealed to him. He saw a community of spirits, a realm of effects and counter-effects, an invisible harmony. Once he discovers the suprasensible realm, the moral world that Günderrode takes up from Fichte, he has no way of turning back. Reality becomes incomplete to him, and he even recognizes that he was never part of it. It is evident that the same thing happened to Günderrode. She distinguishes three distinct lives in a man, an animal, a human, and finally a spiritual one. Once the latter is discovered, both two of the characters in Gesichter eines Brahminen and herself discover in themselves an inner split, an alienation, to which Karoline refers explicitly in a letter to Clemens Brentano in 1803. This is This is the direct verification of the poet's entry into the spiritual state of consciousness, which makes her a stranger to herself. The only method to undo the painful splitting of her identity consists precisely in death. That is why Karoline follows in the footsteps of her character by choosing suicide. If the real world no longer satisfies the needs of the man who has experienced the division of his identity, and thus the most direct manifestation of the will of his spirit, then there remains only death. According to the present investigation, this would have to be qualified as the culminating manifestation of two forces, whose directions, despite being opposite, contribute in equal measure to the very definition of the concept. The first follows a trajectory that dilutes the human being in the whole of nature and therefore returns a development to the earth. This contribution must be applied on a large scale, in other words, on nature as a whole. The second, however, acts as a binding agent in that it reverses the division of identity that the individual undergoes once he discovers the voice of his own spirit. Its point of application is also different, since it is found in the individual himself. And it is precisely the difference in the scale at which each action makes its contribution which allows us to affirm that the result of the sum of both forces or actions gives rise to the preservation of the unity of the individual, and therefore of the earth. This thought shapes a large part of her early poems, in which, through the experience of love, The poet sees in death the opportunity to realize the feelings of lovers that in earthly life could not be accomplished. Thus, the leitmotif of the Liebestod drifts in a higher state, which is nothing more than the realization of the will of the earth that she already expanded in Aneusibius. In Ariane of Naxos, the grieving Ariane does not hesitate and plunges into the flutes. The pain of love will not be immortal, she says. Or in the Malabarisen Bitben, the lyric eye reinforces the idea of death as a new beginning. Death becomes the sweet feast of love, unites the separated elements. The summit of life becomes the end of existence. In Die Wande der Liebe, the death of the beloved unites the lovers eternally. Love is the name of an eternal bond that has united death with life. Günderrode refers to the new state reached after death as a land where the dead speak with the living, in which she will see her longing to find her place with the most sublime come true. Wait, I'm sorry, great. Hence the title of the present article. Günderrode's suicide goes beyond the explanation of a loving nature, after all, Wertherian, that has been given in the last century. In fact, an in-depth study of her work suggests quite the opposite. Karoline von Günderrode's life often took place much more in the realm of literature than in that of the ordinary world. While love is present in her work, for example, in her poem Ariane of Naxos or in Die Wande der Liebe, it is often linked to an underlying philosophical reflection, usually to the search for the absolute, and should therefore not be considered as a separate and independent motive. Under this premise, the aforementioned love poems are based, therefore, on the realization of the two forces already described. So, this was my summary. Thank you so much. I am now open to questions. I don't know if yeah. So,
Thank you so very much, Julia. Muchísimas gracias. I loved your presentation.
Yeah.
I learned a lot because I didn't know this author. And in fact, some people ask me, well, I should give place for the questions of the attendants and the rest of the participants first. But I just want to let you know that some people told me, ask me, okay, why are you introducing in this conference an author from the very beginning of the 19th century? So is this author really contemporary? But I can see the links between her situation and our situation for sure. So I'm gonna give the word to Sara. Sara? This is quite slow today.
Hi.
Yes, please. You can, yes, open your microphone and feel free to ask Julia whatever you want.
Okay. Julia, do you think it's possible to identify Karoline as a feminist?
Oh, thank you so much for the question. I got very fascinated about your question. Yes, I think it is a tricky question because unconsciously, I don't really think she was a feminist in a conscious way, but of course she was in an unconscious way, because she always tried to break the social conventions of her time, and she did it unconsciously. For example, she placed her feminine characters in leading roles, while men remained passive, and I think that justifies that she was a trailblazer of her time. She, yeah, for her ideas and for everything she did. And for example, because she also wrote with a male pseudonym, Tian. So yes, of course, I think she was a feminist, but in an unconscious way. And thank you so much for the question.
Yes, yes. To remember that you can not only to ask question to the speaker, but if you want, we can open a dialogue between us, among us, and you can intervene at any time in this part of the presentation. Yes, to say, okay, I want to add something to what Sara said, or I want to try to answer that question. So this is the reason of this of this 10 minutes. Okay. Anything else?
From my part, or from
Yeah, Julia, why does the article have the title beyond the whether they motive of suicide?
the title? Okay. Why does it have by title? Yes, of course, it is also a very good question. Thank you. Yes, the reason for the title is that it is not. There are a lot of biographies about Günderrode which justify her suicide, saying the reason for her to commit suicide was just a failed love with a scholar. She was in love with Friedrich Kreutzer, and this love couldn't be realized. And yeah, but I think that is not a really deep answer to the reason. I actually think she committed suicide because of her metaphysical concerns. In that way, I mean, her metaphysical concerns underpinned her work and her life, and also underpinned her suicide. I think, presumably, her suicide was the greatest approach to the absolute, because she was always searching the absolute in everything, and she was always searching relationships between things, between love and death, between love and life. I think, really, she did not imitate Beata, the most famous character of Goethe's novel. She did not imitate Beata by committing suicide. It was a very original statement of her thought, I think. And the greatest demonstration for that, I think, is that she, in some of her poems, love poems, she made a connection between love and death. So love is not an independent motive. It is always linked to death. So therefore, she had to justify everything, and she had to underpin or frame her suicide within her philosophical thought, I think.
Yes, we have another question, Diana.
Yeah. Julie, could you please explain again the action of the two complementary forces?
Okay, the action of I made some sort of theory, which states that from her suicide emerged two forces. One of them is a force of dispersion, which dilutes the human being in the whole of nature, so that it realizes the will of the earth. And as I said before, it must be applied on nature as a whole. And this particular force or this process was very influenced by her studies on Asian and East models, which she studied with great enthusiasm. And the other force, the force of unification, this force undoes the inner split that every individual undergoes once he discovers the suprasensible realm. I hope that answers your question.
She didn't say a word, so I I guess you answered the question.
I guess,
Julia.
I guess, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, we have still time for more questions. I'm gonna check the chat box in case you have questions there. Okay, no more questions. So I'm going to ask you something, Julia.
Yes.
Thank you, Diana, Sara. I hope I'm pronouncing your names properly, since I'm not sure if you are from Spain or Latin America, but probably you are Sara and Diana and no Diana or something like that. But please, just be patient with my pronunciation of your names and surnames all the time during these 2 days. Thank you both for your insightful questions. Julia, in social terms, as I was stating some minutes ago, why can we consider Karoline von Günderrode a contemporary author? You shared a quote that said, "Epoch was thought and sensibility are modern, but whose social and material conditions are still medieval." Why can't consider Günderrode a contemporary author? In which sense?
Thank you so much for the question. And
I have another one.
yes, oh, well,
No,
great.
but step by step. I hate when people ask a very long question because I'm not able to pay attention to every word. So this first one, and later we will see.
Great. I have, I don't hear anything now. Can I?
Yeah,
Yes, now, I'm sorry. I wasn't hearing anything. Sorry. Yes, answering to your question, I thank you so much for the question. Yeah, I think she was she could be considered as a contemporary author because of her work and her perspective on everything. I mean, with this, I think she was a victim of the new changes which were coming with the French Revolution. Not She was not a victim of of the modern era, but a victim maybe of an incomplete state, like Christa Wolf said. I think it sheds light, particularly the quote I read, the citation or the text of Christa Wolf, which states that she was a sketch, a project of a modern era. So I think, yes, of course, she dared to enter a male domain, which was, by that time, it was only surrounded by men. They were, they dominated everything. So she dared to create by herself one philosophical system. So I think she was really a trailblazer of her time. She was always picking up ideas from her contemporaries and reworking them. And yeah, so I think, yes, she is absolutely a contemporary author.
Yeah, I totally agree, Julia. I think she deserves a place in this conference and in our proceedings for sure. The other question, okay, she expresses her desire of being a man, to have a good life, to have the opportunities by the same opportunities as them. Do you think this desire apply to our days, to our contemporary world? I mean, Are women still mm, desiring desiring to be men, to have privileges, more opportunities? Do you think women today may want to put an end to their lives because of the current inequalities between men and women, or it this reason for committing suicide old-fashioned? So the situation of Günderrode can apply to our context.
Wow, thank you again for the question. Yeah, wow, it is a very interesting question because I think it depends absolutely on the situation, on the context. It is not the same to be a woman who has a lot of opportunities, who lives in a rich country. Of course, there are differences. I think we still remain not being equal to men. That's a reality. But I really think it is not as easy as it was before in the past to commit suicide because of that. But of course, I think it depends on the country. Um, there are a lot of there is a lot of injustice nowadays, and there could be. It is presumably possible that there are women nowadays who suffer from a collapse between two ideas, two conceptions, two moral virtues. I don't know. There's a lot of there are a lot of variables that change everything. But of course, a little bit of old-fashioned. I think, of course, it can be, but it depends on the situation. I think.
It's a good answer.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Julia, and thank you, Diana and Sara, for
So
your
much.
questions. It was a pleasure to listen to your presentation and to learn a little bit more about this author, who is unknown, I think, especially for those who who are not very familiar with German literature, which is my case. So thank you so very much.
No, thank you. Thank you
So
so much. Yeah, thank you.
we need to move to the next presentation. It's the turn of the independent scholar based in India, Rashmi Joshi. She has recently completed her master's degree in English literature from the University of Delhi. Her areas of interest includes of Asian literature, mental health literature, and gender studies. When not, this is very beautiful. When not reading a book, she is to be found petting dogs or picking up fallen flowers. Joshi is going to present the contribution Death Beats in My Heart Every Day, a sociological reading of suicidal intent in Sara Shagufta's works. Joshi, the floor is yours. I know Josie is here.
Hi, am I audible?
Hi, Josie. Nice to see
Hi,
you.
am I audible?
There is some noise.
Sorry, I can't hear.
There is some noise, but we can hear you.
I'm sorry for the noise, but I think we'll have to deal with it because I don't have any better alternative. So, talking about, thank you for giving me this chance to present at this conference, and I have been really excited for this conference ever since the schedule was released because of so many interesting papers uh, being mentioned, and I'm really looking forward to hearing each one of them. I will start my presentation with a brief introduction about suicide studies. And then I'll go on to give a background of Sara Shagufta, as I think not many of us know about her. Then I'll talk about the link between gender and suicide. and then I'll build up the idea of, which is the main emphasis of my paper, the idea of invisibility of suicide narratives in South Asian context, particularly Indian subcontinent. And then I'll go on to talk about Islam's perception of women in suicide, because Sara Shagufta belonged to Islam religion. So it is important to analyze how Islam's perception of suicide affects readings of Sara Shagufta on her suicide. Then I'll talk about how Sara Shagufta has been erased from Urdu women's poetry. And finally, I'll try to contextualize Sara Shagufta's suicide. So, to start with, suicide has been discussed frequently in literature more than any other mental illness. So, from fictional representation of suicide to autobiographical explorations of writers who die of suicide to the idea of suicide in general, I think philosophers, sociologists, and religious figures all have been preoccupied with the idea of suicide, mostly oscillating between the extreme position of ostracizing people who die of it or being liberal about it and considering it as a matter of individual choice. So, in the case of critical readings of authors of suicides of authors, the dominant framework has been to chart out an autobiographical account of their life and then read their works concerning it, analyzing the overt and covert ways in which the desire to consider suicide finds a way in their writings. So, in a very prominent seminal work in suicide studies, The Savage God by L. Alvarez, he talks about the genealogy of suicide and how perception about it changed with different periods of history. More importantly, as we moved from society at the core of human life to a more individual centered society. So this statement by L. Alvarez catches my attention always. He says that, and I'm quoting him here. Suicide has permeated Western culture like a dye that cannot be washed out. And this reflects how suicide has become a part of mainstream discussion in the West, so much so that its reading is almost normalized. The pitfall of this, however, is that we there is an absence of nuances while dealing with the idea of suicide. With an increased focus on the universality of a theory that subassumes and thus neglects how motivations can differ with individuals from different gendered, cultural, and social backgrounds. So, of all the theories that Alvarez discusses in his book, almost all of them are characterized by a focus on the workings of the mind of the potential people who die of suicide, leaving out the factors outside the mind that could aggravate and sometimes be the primary causes of suicidal instincts, which is evident in Sara Shagufta's case. So, and this is also evident in research-based results that have shown that there are a variety of reasons that contribute to suicide, external as much as internal, and sometimes amalgamation of the two. So, in the context of South Asian countries, especially the Indian subcontinent, the problem does not lie in the assumption of centrality of Western world when we're talking about theories of suicide, but the problem lies in the invisibility of cases of author suicide or invisibility of authors to be studied. So, through meditation on the causes of this relative invisibility of a focus on the life and works of a significant but neglected Pakistani poet, Sara Shagufta, I'll try to work towards an intersection of the mechanics of gender and cultural setting and analyze how it affects one's propensity to give in to suicide and how there is an urgent need to reimagine preventive measures by localizing research rather than universalizing. So going on to talk about a brief background of Sara Shagufta. So she was born on 31 October 1954 in Pakistan, and she was a part of a lower middle class family, and this is very important because I think her economic status also played a very important role in her propensity to give in to suicide or to give in to suicidal instincts. Uh, so. A part of Sarah's childhood was spent in helping her mother with managing the household with for bare minimum. For example, in her letters to Amrita Preetham, she talks about how they used to make garlands to 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 fulfill their very basic necessities like food and everything. So she mentions in her letters to, so grief, the idea of grief was part of Shagufta's life from her very childhood. So in her letters to Amrita Preetham, which is a primary material for my research, she mentions being conscious of her mother's grief and plight while dealing with. So her mother uh, uh, was in love with a man and married a man who then deceived her and married to some other women. So she was very conscious of all this. And also, since she was very empathetic, she connected to her mother, and she was conscious of this idea of grief, and this percolated in her consciousness later. Uh, so. Uh, so she was married to a poet when she was very young, when she was 17, and then she went on to marry later, like after she came out of this marriage because it was very abusive. Then she went on to have uh, three other marriages, and each marriage she had to face a lot of domestic violence in each of these marriages. And she mentions these distressing instances of domestic violence in her letters to Amrita Preetham, how she was constantly beaten for doing something as basic as stepping out of the home, how she was told to not write. So all these things, and these things contributed to her desire to die. So, in addition, and not just this, she was also separate. She also had to stay away from her three children because her husband did not want her to stay in touch with him, and this also contributes to her suicidal instinct. And she also had to witness the death of a newborn child uh, due to the negligence of her husband, and dealt with she dealt with depression because of this. So, all in all, Sara Shagufta was traumatized because of the experiences of all the relationships that she tried to build through the institution of marriage. Uh, her third husband's insistence on her not reading or writing or stepping outside the house alone, as for him, and I quote this from her letters, it was in accordance with the custom of the house that women shouldn't step out of the house, is an echo of the patriarchal mentality of all the men whom she married, abusive, patriarchal, and restrictive. And I think these experiences affected her mental health severely, and she also underwent electric shock therapy more than once. Most of her poems and letters, and it is important to note this, that most of her poems and letters were written during her first marriage and her death. So they are reflective of how she dealt with all the circumstances that she went through. So her poems are reflexive of her agony that screams trauma in metaphors that are devoid of life and search death repeatedly. For example, in lines like, I remain under the sneaky watch of my coffin. I'm drowning in the mud. I have to die alone. So now going on talking about the link between gender and suicide. So in the dominant framework of reading suicide in the Western world, the gendered reading of it was theoretically strengthened in the Victorian England. It was present before it, but in the Victorian England, it was very much strengthened. While female suicides were trivialized as emotional acts, male suicides were contextualized in their financial and social cultural background. And this is a reflection of the gender politics of the Victorian times, imitating the gender role binaries that were prevalent in the society, with women being relegated to more passive private sphere and men being a part of supposedly active public sphere. So this gender, and I think this has not stopped with the Victorian times. This gendered reading of suicide has passed on since then and can be distinctly seen in the readings of the suicide of authors in the 20th century, wherein the case of women writers, suicide is read through an exploration of their emotional well-being, prominent in case of Sylvia Plath. And in case of male writers, it becomes a philosophical and sociological problem. So in his study, so there's this paper by Howard I. Kushner called Women in Suicide in Historical Perspective, where he argues that this link between gender and suicide is based on this presumption that hasn't been verified or looked through different lenses and ways of sampling. Rather, what keeps happening is that these presumptions continue to affect theories that assume the gender feature of suicide as a given, leading to more strengthened readings rather than readings that attempt to debunk these facts. So, but still, the link between gender and suicide, there is a link between gender and suicide, and it is more complicated than this. violence, and it is explored by a study by WHO, where they talk about the study claims that it is due to the prescribed gender roles that place women in a lower social and cultural hierarchy than men, that they are exposed to negative experiences. These negative experiences, as prominent in case of Sara Shagufta also, they cause mental health risk factors, which are a major reason for the psychological disorders apparent in women that involve serious violation of their rights as human beings, including their sexual and reproductive rights. So, although the study assumes universality, I think this is very much true in case of South Asian countries, specifically Indian subcontinent, more so in rural areas where the gender hierarchies are more solidified than the contemporary urban or Western society. So, Sara Shagufta's personal life, with her repeated emphasis on her encounters with domestic violence in all her four marriages, and her husband's insistence on punishing her, as in when she trespassed the traditionally submissive role that was assigned to women, is a testimony to this fact. There's this line in her letters where she says that, however, this is not a big issue. The husbands in a society are like this only, and wives have to be receptive of this. So this makes a connection between her personal experience and the repressive and patriarchal society of her time. Now moving on to talking about the invisibility of suicide narratives and why they are invisibilized in South Asian context. So there's this study by Zubair Ahmed, Ilyas Bhatti, and Rizwan Kaushal, where they link the predominance of being vulnerable to mental illness or suicide in women with the invisibility of statistics on suicide in the public sphere. So it's not that in South Asian countries the cases of suicides are less, but it's that these cases are not brought to the public sphere. So official records of suicide, as they argue, are not maintained by the police due to their apparent link with domestic disputes, something that is considered as a private matter. So, in lieu of official documentation, studies on suicide in Pakistan have to rely on information collected by NGOs and newspaper articles, where suicides are mentioned frequently of people of all genders, but these suicides fail to be registered or recorded due to a lack of systemized way to keep track of these suicides. And this is also true because legal implication because this also happens because of legal implications, because suicide is seen as a criminal offense in Pakistan under Pakistan Penal Code 309. So this also contributes to the relative invisibility of suicide narratives in South Asian countries. And in addition to this, from the socio-cultural perspective, suicides are connected to family corner more so in South Asian countries, and especially in cases of suicide by women, where families try to prohibit the access of information about suicide in their family to the public sphere, as it might cause damage to their social respectability. Thus, writings that anticipate suicide then also encounter similar censure at the hands of the family as well as state. And to give example from Sara Shagufta's life, so Sara Shagufta wrote a lot of letters to Amrita Pritam and her other friends. So her family, when she died of suicide, after she died of suicide, her family decided to tried to burn her letters and poems and considered them as trash, so that they could be hidden from the eyes of public. So this is reflective of how suicide is connected to family honor and how families try to not bring it to the public sphere. Now talking about Islam's perception of human suicide. So, although it has been argued by consensus amongst researchers that Islam openly condemns suicide for all genders equally, and statistics about suicide might trick one into believing that the least percentage of suicidal cases are from countries with high religious participation. But this aligns again with the underreporting of such cases due to concerns over public disgrace in these countries. In a study on suicides in Pakistan, Murad Musa Khan and Hashim Raza debunked this myth in case of Islam, specifically Pakistan, arguing that the strong religious prescriptions of suicide do not simply lead to a lowered cases of suicide. Instead, the real number of cases are hidden due to notions of national and personal shame. So again, while researchers argue that there is no difference between how Islam religious texts treat women and men in case of legal and social implications or implementations, But when we see the cultural background, for example, the violent Islamization of Muhammad Ziaul Haq's regime in Pakistan, this is the time when Sara Shagufta was writing. It is an example of how orthodox interpretation of Islam, not the actual Islam, but how it is interpreted by men, orthodox men. It is not only biased towards women, but acts as a threat to their freedom and humaneness, instantly claiming for them a subordinate position than that of men. So, in the predicament of cases of suicide, then women face more taboo than men because of their socially sanctioned inferior position, and the notion that they're seen as primary holders of honors of the family, which gets shattered with any deviation from them in normal religious or social life. Now, talking about Sara Shagufta and how she has been erased from the canon of Urdu women's poetry, not only in from the canon of poetry in general, but not only from the canon of Urdu poetry, but from the canon of poetry in general. I haven't seen many of Sara Shagufta's poems being translated or studies being taken up for critical readings. So, since we talked about the society that Sara Shagufta lived in, it is true that she was not only at disadvantage because of her gender, like her contemporary women poets, but she was also at a disadvantage because of her economic condition, because she came from a lower middle class background. And Kamran Asghar Ali, a very famous scholar who has written extensively, probably the only scholar who has written extensively on Sara Shagufta, explains the impact of her class on how she was morally policed for her life choices. And I quote from Kamran Asghar Ali. So he says that the reasons for which are at times found in her belonging to the lower class, with its implicit connotation of an immoral upbringing. So, in addition to this, Sara Shagufta failed to keep her lived experiences and her written words at a distance, which most of the women writers of her times did. They tried to somehow fit in. They were not exactly going with the flow of the society, but they tried somehow to fit in into the society and not revolutionize very clearly. But Sara Shagufta failed to do so. That's why she has been erased even more so from the canon of Urdu poetry. In addition to, like the poets of her times, who used to see Sara Shagufta as a woman morally and sexually deviant over colleague poets, the male-dominant Urdu poetic and academic circle continues to refuse to read Sara Shagufta's poems as an expression of her agony that can easily be extended to cover the general conditions of lower Muslim class women in Pakistan of her times. So, male Urdu poets are famous despite their ways of living outside the moral center of society, but a woman poet like Sara Shagufta is denied readership not only by intellectuals but by her family members who are ashamed of her because of her ways of living, and they try to control the accessibility of her writings by burning them and not allowing them into the public domain. Asad Alvi, who is a translator of Sara Shagufta's poems in journal entries, sees her poems as an expression of agency and sees her experiences as a testimony to her defiant spirit. But I find Alvi's statement problematic because more than an expression of agency, Shagufta's works, including her poems, are a shrill cry of a woman so helpless and tortured at the hands of the patriarchal world of Pakistan that she chose to be silent. And she constantly talks about the silence in her poems, how she has to recede to silence because she finds nobody she can talk to in a setting where people are so different from how she ideally imagines a society to be. So there's this work by, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name right, but Marta Caminaro Secangelo, and this book is called "The Mad Women Can't Speak" or "Why Insanity Is Not Subversive." And in this, she talks about how, and I'll quote from her. Perhaps the reason why the mad woman continues to be such an enticing figure is that she offers an illusion of power. Although she provides a symbolic resolution whose only outcome must be greater helplessness. So, this is true in case of Sara Shagufta, who is constantly read in the liminal space that she is read, as someone who exercised her agency while continuing to assert her selfhood in defiance of the norms of Pakistan society of her times. So, I think although such a reading is constructive in creating a space for her in the world of Urdu poets, But I think it complicates her agony as a crime, something that Sara Shagufta would have herself disapproved. She would have never considered her agony as a triumph, or she would have never seen her suicide as triumph, as something that she as something that she sees as triumphant against the being triumphant against the society oftentimes. So, in her lifetime, Shagufta was not only devoid of hope due to her life circumstances, but also due to the male dominated Mushaira culture in Pakistan. This male dominated poetic culture constantly reduced her to her body, as a contemporary male poets schooled her to conduct herself more respectably to be taken seriously. And there's an instance in her letter to Amrita Pritam where she says that when she visited this one Mushaira, and after the Mushaira ended, there's this male poet's wife who said that Sara Shagufta is a nice poet, but she has no sense of how to dress herself. So this is how her works were constantly linked to how her lifestyle was or how she conducted herself. Her letters bring about the difficulty of existing as a single woman poet in Urdu poetic circle in Pakistan society. Uh, Sorry. So this friend of hers, Atiya Dawood, who is also a contemporary of Sara Shagufta, she also acknowledges this violent gender politics that is prevalent in intellectual spaces in Pakistan that made it difficult for women poets to exist in that literary space. And this can be seen in the way Sara Shagufta has been erased from the canon of Urdu poetry despite being acknowledged for her enormous literary talent, as her poems are continuously read as an extension of herself, trivialized by the gendered readings, thinking of them as mere cries of a mad woman, as opposed to the supposedly philosophical sound voices of male Urdu poets. So, throughout her life and even after, Shagufta has been read through a lens of morality that condemns her not because of her poems, but refuses to read her works or her poems because of what they know of her life. So, in two separate readings of suicide, primarily concerned with Pakistan, marriage is connected to an increased vulnerability to mental distress for women. In the light of this finding and evidence from the letters that Shagufta wrote to Preetham, it wouldn't be an overstatement to conclude that Sara Shagufta's deteriorating mental health is closely connected to her mental life, to her married life, and by extension to her children. Children are a dominant imagery in her poems. Her grief of being parted from them, of seeing her firstborn child die prematurely, contributes to her vehement disorientation with the ways of living of the world. In this poem of hers, The Milestone Accompanies for Hours, which has been translated by Arshi Asim, Shagufta breathes this pain of longing of seeing her child on paper as she writes, My children's misfortunes have stained my clothes. So, Shagufta's preoccupation with death and related imageries is apparent in her poems as well as her letters. Death in her works finds semblance in various imageries that she creates to make it appear more real and alive. For example, she connects colors to the idea of death. She calls death as a dyer of clothes, something that is related to color. Although her poems and her letters are read as an extension of her personal life, she constantly connects this personal world of hers to that of women in Pakistan with rhetorical questions like, Does a woman have no more of a country than her body? The statement is from her letter to Amrita Pritham. And her reflections on general condition of women in Pakistan, as she talks about this, there's this line in this one poem of hers where she says, "We are the eyes devoid of hope." In her letters, Shagufta continues to draw upon the experiences of other women in Pakistani society, indicating the widespread nature of violence exercised by the agents of patriarchy that has led many women to the edges. In her experience of staying at the mental asylum, Shagufta talks about fellow women patients that she met there, each narrating a story of oppression, abuse, violation at the hands of men that led them to the mentally unstable condition that they are in. In a society like this, distinctively different from that of her Western counterparts, reading Sara Shagufta's Suicide just as a philosophical problem, isolated from the socio-cultural environment of her times, I think it seems like a redundant attempt. So I think there is a need to step out of the philosophical framework and locate her life within a social, cultural, and political setting of Pakistan, where, as her fellow patients in the mental asylum where she lived told her, that to step out into the outside world of the asylum is to actually step into the real asylum. So I think the point of discussing author suicides or reading author suicide should not be to qualify these acts as triumphant for them or to take away the agency from these authors and theorize suicide, but to see how there are several factors that lead to conditions where suicide is the only option that left for them. How the mind works when one is thinking of suicide, and how suicidal ideation is not a permanent state of mind but is affected by multiple factors, multiple experiences, multiple situations that one goes through. Factors that can be eliminated to some extent if we approach this idea with with a motive to understand the issues and not to read suicide as a triumphant thing. That's it from my side.
Thank you so very much. Wow, I have a lot of ideas in my mind right now because your presentation focuses on a South Asian author who is unrepresented in suicide studies, and thanks to this kind of presentations, we can decenter the focus from Western writers and question, as you mentioned, the idea of a single universal theory of suicide. So I would like to ask the attendees if you want to, do you have any questions? I'm gonna check the chat box. Any question for Rashmi Joshi? Okay, I have a couple of questions or commentaries, but I'm gonna give place first. Yeah, you see have a question.
Thank you very much. A very short question, because this presentation comes from another part of the world map, right? As you were saying before. Is literature about or of authors who committed or thought or tried to commit suicide a kind of literature that has many authors that can be included, or it's something really, very rare in that part, in your country, in fact? Thank you.
So it's right. So it's not very rare. There are several authors who have considered suicide and several authors who have written about suicide in fictional works. But my point is that theoretical study, there is a very less theoretical study about the same. So while I was researching about Sara Shagufta, I was trying to find out if there has been studies on suicide in South Asian context, and I found out that there have been studies. There have been sociological studies, psychological studies, but from a very literary perspective. The works of the authors who died of suicide, they're not available in public domain in translation. For example, even Sara Shagufta wrote her original work. Her letters are originally in Urdu and Hindi. So there's only one translation available, and even that translation is rarely available. So it's difficult to find as I talked about, because it's so limited, because people try to limit the public coming out of such material. So the very material is so limited. That's why research on same looks so limited. But I don't think the cases there are less cases, or there is a connection between the invisibility of study and invisibility of authors who die of suicide. There are authors who have died of suicide. I think there's another another paper presentation in this panel on Sarwat Hussain, who is also someone who comes from South Asian background and who wrote about suicide. So, and there are several other authors as well, and even fictional works.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Yusi. Thank you, Joshi. Um, in your presentation and also in the chapter you are contributing to this volume on suicide and authors, you emphasize that preventive measures need to be reimagined, localized rather than universalized to understand and eliminate the causes of suicide based on spatial and cultural differences. Yes. I would like to know, according to your knowledge and your experience, to which extent or how has the situation improved in this sense from the time in which Sara Shagufta wrote her works to the present?
Okay. Thank you so much for the comment and the question. So I think about the perception has changed somewhat in the sense that, for example, when I was talking about Sara Shagufta, I was talking about this shock therapy and how her experience of being at the asylum. So the institution of mental health care was not very accepting and not very developed in her times, but I think it has improved at present. So Sara Shagufta seeked medicine. She did take medications, and she was prescribed. She was asked to not write. So her therapist or her psychiatrist asked her to not write. So I think this perception has changed from then to now, wherein people have a better understanding of mental health issues, mental illness, and thus there is a better mental health care system which tries to understand the reasons why someone would want to attempt suicide before prescribing medication or before prescribing any solution. So I think it's more contextualized now. The context one's context and one's situation is taken into account more than it was taken in Sara Shagufta's time, and also factors like the idea of how oppressed women were and how they were abused, the idea of violence. So violence cases of uh, women being subjected to domestic violence, but I think it has reduced from Sara Shagufta's times. So this is how I think the situation has changed from her time. So she's not too old a poet. She died in 1984, very close. I mean, very close to the 21st century. So I think it.
Thank you, thank you. I was having some cuts in my connection, so I lost part of your answer, but don't worry about that because I can write you an email at any time because this is uh, an issue I'm interested in. Not so much from the part of suicide, but from the part of boredom. I'm trying to find researchers studying, conducting research on boredom from non-Western traditions. So perhaps you can help me a little bit with this task. Thank
I'm
you.
very happy to help.
Thank you so very much. I'm not paying too much attention to. I'm not managing the time for this panel because since Iman is not participating today, we have a lot of time. So, but in the next panel, I will I will be using this raise a hand button just in case you are over the time. So thank you, Josie. We are gonna give place to Andrea Marín, who is the last speaker in this panel. Andrea, I'm very happy to meet you.
Hello.
Hello, hola, ¿qué tal?
Nice to meet you.
This is this will be from time to time a bilingual conference in which there are a lot of people from Spain and some of them from Latin America. And at times people ask me, why don't you are organizing a bilingual conference? But after all, since this is a sequel from other conferences which took place in English, and or chapters or volume is gonna be launched in English too, I prefer to keep this language, which is universal after all. So I'm gonna introduce you. Yeah, Andrea Marín Gil got a bachelor's degree in philosophy. There are a lot of philosophers here too. She has a master in religion science and currently is a PhD candidate in philosophy at Complutense University of Madrid on the subject of philosophy and religion, attention, in Japanese literature after the Second World War. She is going to present Through the Mask, Behind the Osamu Dazai's Smile. Enjoy yourselves. And Andrea, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be able to participate today. Well, Dazai is one of my favorite authors and is one of the authors I'm studying in my research. So let's get started. I share my screen. Okay. Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. So, although it's difficult to develop and explain in depth in this presentation, I would like to make a first approach to Osamu Dazai's work within the context of pain, death, and suicide. So there were 4 suicide attempts by Osamu Dazai before he successfully execute his goal in the spring of 1948. And there were several reasons why Dazai gambled with his life from his youth until he ended at the age of 38. For a better understanding, let's locate ourselves in the historical context in which Dazai is situated between the rise of Japanese nationalism and the beginning of the transition period after the end of the Second World War, when the values of the preceding era were no longer fully useful. This period in which he's involved, in addition to his family and personal situation, will be manifested throughout his works, culminating in No Longer Human and The Setting Sun, where some of the most notable aspects in which Dazai portrays himself are the following ones. Affective dependence of a female figure as the result of a feeling of maternal rejection. Dazai was forced to move in with his aunt, who was the one who raised him, because his mother fell ill, and whom he somehow considers to be his mother. This feeling of abandonment, the repudiation he somehow suffered from his mother is transformed, mentioned at least in this two last publication, into a need to always represent female affection towards him as care, either through female characters as a romantic partner or as a full representation of a maternal character. On the other hand, it is seen as a transgression of the established values, as these no longer have any real value. It is in some way in dispute with the social values of the moment, which in some way no longer fit with the new realities. The society pretends to show an optimism that should be generated through the passage to modernization, industrialization, and democracy, when in reality there is a lack of moral and identity criteria towards the new upstart reality. For this reason, he and his narrative often have an alienating tinge with respect to current reality. His work is narratively framed within the personalist novel, the I novel, Shisosetsu in Japanese, as a literary current Dazai belonged, along with the other great writers such as Ango Sakaguchi, to the Buraiha or School of Decadence, because of the nihilistic and individualistic or self-destructive tone outside the social framework in which both their lives in their works were enveloped. And it's important to not emphasize too much the autobiographical aspect of the novels, but rather the concept of the self-portrait in which Dazai represents in his characters the self-perception of himself and not his real objective self, demystifying the fact that he was not capable of creating fictional characters beyond his real projection in them. The concept of the self is a literary element that moves between objective reality, his perceived reality, and fiction. And proof of this is the numerous times throughout his works that he will tell us in different ways about one of his suicide attempts, where in each story he will highlight a different aspect. He will shed light on a different element. In this way, we know the general fact of this event that really happened, but always from the framework that Dazai wants to show us. Knowing this, I will briefly comment on the conditions and moments of his life in which Dazai committed his suicide attempts to finally deal with his last two novels. The first attempt occurs in 1929 as an apology for being born into the wrong social class. At the time, a 20-year-old Dazai, who was flirting with the Communist Party, is faced with the shame of having been born into a family well positioned in relation to the lower social classes. So he tries to commit suicide to apologize for his status as a privileged child. But although Dazai called himself a peasant son, this mere play with Japanese communists was not so much out of conviction as perhaps as a response of the people who moved in that circle. However, both the routine of political militancy and his nihilistic tendency made his political ideology a void. Throughout his life and literary career, we can see an absence of values that motivated the misery of the post-war period. The second attempt was made at the end of 1930 when he was a university student. On this occasion, he planned his suicide with a prostitute from a bar he frequented. After taking barbiturates, they both threw themselves into the sea, but Dazai survived the attempt, unlike his companion who ended up drowning. This is not the last time that Dazai will need a woman to carry out his suicide. After the being expelled from the university for lack of attendance, he sought solace in drink. And in 1935, he proceeded to take his own life voluntarily to the third time, and in this time with an attempt to hang himself. After this last unsuccessful bid, he suffered worsening appendicitis in this situation, who was medicated with morphine, to which he became addicted. Once he had recovered from his addiction, the fourth try was motivated by the betrayal of his wife, who cheated on him with one of his friends. And finally, in June 1948, 3 days before his 39th birthday, Dazai threw himself with another woman into the Tama River Canal, ending their lives. As we can see, Dazai's life has been erratic, driven by unstable emotions. If we talk about the classification of the type of suicidal attempts or suicide committed by the author from Durkheim's point of view, it's difficult to pigeonhole him either from the point of selfish suicide, in which many artists and intellectuals are framed, where a personal and individualistic reflection takes place, in which the intellectual turns in on himself, or the anomic suicide, where voluntary death is brought about as a consequence of crisis or changes where desires and passions lack limits and therefore lack purpose. Since the causes of suicide are not pure and isolated, but converge with each other, it's likely that in Dazai's case, characteristics of both types of suicide converge. So this, together with the emptiness that the writer feels, made him seek external sensations that could enliven him in some way. However, we will see that, especially in the novel No Longer Human, as Wolf says, Dazai projects a living dead man. With this, I would like to comment briefly on certain aspects of the setting sun, so that you can get a slight idea of the nature of the characters, to finally go deeper into No Longer Human, which to me shows the harshness and rawness of Dazai's perspective, not only on human beings, but also himself. In the setting sun, we find 4 fundamental characters, which in 3 of them we can see where Dazai's personality is divided. The novel tells the story of the decadence of the Japanese aristocracy, in which a good family, due to ravages of war, is forced to move to a rural landscape on the Izu Peninsula. There we met Kazuko, who narrates the novel in the first person, a woman who transgresses the moral values of the time and even family values, and wants to become a mother using a married man. Naoji, her brother, who returns after participating in the war, addicted to opium and with a halo of contempt for the bourgeois class, boasting in a way of a certain moral and intellectual superiority, which nevertheless ends up enveloping him in a miserable reality of which he does not feel a part. Moreover, we will find the point of a connection between the 2 characters, his mother, as a true reflection of the last alien remnant of the aristocracy. As I have been saying, the presence of the woman in Dazai's novels is obvious. And in this case, the importance of maternal affection is evident, as it is the only point of union between the siblings, and above all, it is present in the lives of both. There remains a 4th character. Uehara is an exemplification of a writer of the decline, who in his time had some success, and who wastes his life between drink and certain environments. These 3 main characters, Kazuko, Naoji, and Uehara, are the 3 forms of the author's alter ego at the different moments in his life. Kazuko's nonconformist to the imposition of social values, a young Naoji with aspiration of an artist in a world in which he does not identify himself, and Uehara, a writer who squanders his existence in erratic life. This plus the various allusions to suicide. First, Kazuko, who fantasized about it as an apology for her mistakes, and then Naoji, who mentioned it in his diary until finally committing it, leaves us with clues or prepares us not to be surprised when it comes to Dazai's tragic end. Finally, we come to what for me is his masterpiece, although foremost experts and critics is the one I have just explained. I love this novel. No Longer Human. In No Longer Human, we are introduced to Yoso Oda, who as soon as he is conscious, finds himself on the fringe of a society in which he doesn't share values, which he doesn't understand, in which he doesn't fit in. To survive, Joseph creates a character to show to the world. He puts on a mask to allow him to live in a world in which he fears human beings. Thus, both Dazai and Joso become actors in their own lives. And I am returning here to the original meaning of the ancient Greek term prosopon, that the masked Greek performers put on in shows and which would give rise to the term person. This mask is engraved with a smile, a false smile, to be shown to the world so that it doesn't see his marked inner self. In this way, Joseph fights and lives in fear that someone will discover his trap. In this struggle to survival, in which the character does his best to please others, a metamorphosis takes place. The protagonist gradually loses the meaning of his action in life. There is a feeling of alienation from everyday human life. Joseph, whose profession and frustration vocation is the creation of paintings, sees in them the true nature of his being, what he really hides, a non-human being within a reality in which he has nothing to identify with. The identity crisis that involves the society of the moment is reflected in Joseph. In the same way, Dazai uses his literature to expose the crudest part of himself. What if the only way for the author character to make himself real and true is through his art? With Joshi in this novel, Dazai questions the meaning and the concept of society. Who is society really? Which accepts or not, legitimizes or not individual acts? Can a single individual speak for society? And if so, is it because that the person is within the social frameworks and gains that were established at some point in time? But Dazai and Joshi feel themselves on the margins, alienated in some way. In this game, where the character is blurred with the author, we saw allusions and narrations of their suicide attempts, the constant need for female support and figure due to lack of affection and abandonment, their amusements with different addiction until they find themselves in ruin, the meaninglessness of the context and social values. Joshi, who the beginning is presented as a child with a smile, a false smile, yes, but a smile that gives him the ability to comply with social demands, and there goes a transformation, a metamorphosis throughout the novel in which he is consumed by grief. In my existence, there is no longer happiness of suffering. Everything passes. That is the only truth in my whole life, is spent in the endless hell of human society. Everything passes. With his halo of resignation and decadence, Dazai leaves a semi-open ending to what happens to Joshi, but one that is easily interpretable. With this, I hope I have been able to show, even if only briefly, how to uncertain reality in which Dazai lived, a period of transition, of loss of identity after the defeat of 1945, plus his own personal consideration, moved this author to create harsh and dark novels in which, by the way, there is no lack of sarcasm, where his suicide attempts served as inspiration for him in the same way that I would even say that they serve to reaffirm his decision. I consider it important to see how psychosocial and psycho-emotional realities undermine the stability of the different authors of the time. Hopefully, this intervention will encourage you to get a little closer to to this fantastic writer who gives us so many questions to think about and be critical of. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Andrea. What does... Oh. I'm sorry.
Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you, I can hear you, but I need you to switch your microphone off for a while, because I'm listening to my own voice in your... You understand? Okay. Thank you. What an interesting presentation. Oh my God. Do you have questions for Andrea? I know some of you are interested in Japanese literature and the Japanese society. Julia?
Sorry, yes, I was turning on my microphone. Thank you so much, Andrea, for your research, for your summary. I was only just wondering, is it possible to draw an analogy between the main character of No Longer Human and Osamu Dazai? I think so, but yeah.
Yes, of course, but it's a little bit difficult because it's not an autobiographical, it's more a self-portrait. So I think in No Longer Human, Dazai is puts all him heart, I think, and yes, this is an analogy or parallelism between his life and the novel. That it's true. He is so sarcastic, very sarcastic, so much, and the same. I don't know how can I say. The same moment in his life can tell you in different ways. It depends that the feeling or how they him feel in that moment. Thank you for the question.
No, thank you so much for the answer. Thank you. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you to you.
Anybody else? You have more questions? You have to speak now, or... No, we have time to discuss along these 2 days. Wow, what a life, poor Dazai. Not boring at all, I think. Well, it's difficult to determine to which extent its society influencing mental health and vice versa. You know, it's clear that we cannot assume one reason alone as the main cause for suicide, for committing suicide. And I was shocked by your presentation, just because so what I understood is we should pay attention to those who smile too much, for example, because maybe they are pretending to be very happy when they are suffering after all. So this complicates things a lot, I think, since this kind of behavior is associated with happiness, not suicidal intention. So are there other gestures or other behaviors we usually associate with happiness we should take into account, because they could be masking this intention of commit suicide, apart from a smile too much? Or what do you think about this, Andrea?
I don't know if there are another times, but it's true. In Japan, there are two concepts, Tatemae and Honne, and this means two the people have two behaviors. One to show to the society a public behavior, and another behavior with yourself that sometimes are not the same feelings. And so you can show to the people your nice kind, your nice side, because if you show your sadness, for example, maybe you can feel uncomfortable to the other person. Yeah.
Oh, I thought it was as how to say, people don't want to show, sorry, their bad feelings, because this is a signal of failure, because if you are a sad person, if you are not happy, if you don't show your happiness to the rest of the world, that means that you are a person that is frustrated because you don't get to have the job you desire, you don't have a marriage in which you are happy, so you are I cannot find the word in English right now, but in Spanish is fracasado. You're a failure in the society. You cannot get to reach the standard, the status quo, more or less. But no, it's because you don't want to make other people feel uncomfortable. So, wow, like it's like yeah, okay. It's like when you don't want to show to the other people you are a boring person just because the rest of the people is gonna say, okay, if you are a boring person, you are going to bore me. So I don't want to have a relationship with you and to spend my time with you just because I'm gonna get bored because of you. So it's incredible. I wanted also to emphasize something you wrote in your abstract for this conference, that Dazai became an influence in pop culture of anime and manga.
Yes.
In which sense? Can you provide some examples?
Yes.
I'm not
This novel, No Longer Human, has a manga, two mangas done by different authors or manga artists, and there is an anime that the Bungo Stray Dogs. It's so interesting. I love that that anime because you can show, you can see the different Japanese authors, and they combine or mix the behaviors that that authors with, for example, French or British authors. So nice because it's for example, the authors have powers, and the powers are about their own novels or own essays, for example. And yes, and they fight with the, for example, the power of the Dazai is no longer human, and the, for example, the, I don't know, another one. Junichiro Tanizaki, for example, it's with another essay, and you can see in their powers the meaning of the novel. I don't know if I explained that. And it's so,
yeah.
And it's and I think there is, yes, that in about the Osamu side there is a film, an anime film, that the name is Human Lost. It's a little bit futurist. I don't like it so much, but yes.
Gaston Alejandro Marquez wrote in the chat box, wow, I think he has just discovered the next manga series to watch too. Yeah, it's super interesting. Well, we need now first of all, any other questions? Any other questions, commentaries? Oh yeah, you see?
Thank you both. I have two questions for Andrea. And one is, can you tell us something more about the relationship with the mother? Because you've been mentioning it in one of the slides, and that would be interested in knowing something more. And the other is, did the manga appear after he committed suicide?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
The manga is a few years ago. It's new. And about his mother, it's so difficult because they don't he don't talk about her. He or not so much, and he talk with the relation with another woman, but there is an absence of mother figure in their lives because that's the absence care of mother cares. You can show you can see it in how he in his relationships with another woman, and in his novel, in all his novel, the presence of the woman are so hard because he felt, I suppose, he felt so sad because all my brothers and sisters has a relation with my mother, but I can't because she's feel ill, and I need to move in with my auntie, for example. No, yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
Yes, thank you very much. It's very interesting because later on I will be talking about Haize, who is a Chinese poet, and it's there are some threads that could be just linked in one way or the other, but maybe this is for later. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
More questions? It's crazy being enjoying a conference on suicide. It's weird, don't you think so? But I'm enjoying a lot this panel, which is coming to its end, unfortunately. But we have many other presentations later. I was just thinking, Andrea, that it's very different. At least I don't know in the rest of Europe, but at least in Spain, which is better thing is to show your emotions, and as worse are these emotions, is better because you are showing your true self. It's being pretending to be happy is like a, how to say, when we see people on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, just being very happy and all the time enjoying their lives, their perfect lives, people feel like, okay, so I don't, I'm not interested in that. I don't like to see, I don't enjoy seeing how happy you are with your life and how you show that to the rest of the world. But on the contrary, when we share, for example, on Twitter, I'm having a really bad time after the death of my father, and this kind of things, people always offer their support, their help, some kind words, just to it's very different, I think, with regarding Japan. Don't you think so? It's totally the contrary. The
Yes,
contrary.
yes. Yes, he tries to think so much in the others and not so much about himself. Yeah, it's difficult, and I think it's so important to think about this because to see the reasons or the clues that why the people commit suicide. For example, not only a philosophical level, but a psychological level. This kind of behavior is a detonant, could be a detonant to commit this. It's I try to research about this.
Yeah, I was thinking that there are people who commit suicide, and everybody surrounding that person said it's incredible because they was always saying everything was fine, was always sharing beautiful pictures of their weekends and always smiling. So wow, it's very complicated. It's very complicated, and sometimes having that people writing literature is the only mean or the only way in which that people really expresses their feelings, their true feelings. So this is one more reason for having people writing. This is the motif of this conference. We need to have people writing always, just to be trying to detect this intention that people is crying inside themselves, or they are asking us for support, for help. So